Coming up on Food for Thought, it's Arab food etiquette. This episode's guest speaker is Amy Riolo. She'll be discussing the interesting history and customs around the Middle Eastern dinner table. You're watching Food for Thought on MCTV. Everybody has to eat, but not everyone knows nutrition. To help solve this crisis, Food for Thought provides some helpful info to show how to eat healthy. Now, we don't promise to return you to your high school playing weight or that you'll be able to squeeze back into a size 8 dress, but we will help you choose healthy meals that are quick and cheap. Each episode is produced with the help of the Hospitality Management Department at Montgomery College and the Marriott Hospitality Center on the Rockville campus. Food for Thought is an MCTV production. You can view this program and many others anytime on our YouTube and podcast sites. Okay, so you've had the appetizer, now for the meal. Let's gather the ingredients and start cooking. Table manners are very important. Not having them can really have a bad impact. But think of this. What if you were eating at a table with people from a different culture? What may be polite to you may be insulting to them. It's increasingly more common as cultures converge. And people looking to get ahead, either socially or in business, often benefit by doing a little bit of homework before sitting down to eat. To help us learn more, Montgomery College asked Amy Riolo to do a presentation at their Rockville campus. Ms. Riolo is an internationally recognized culinary expert. She is the author of 3 cookbooks on Mediterranean and Middle Eastern cuisine and culture.
One of my colleagues works at the Wall Street Journal, and she was working on a business piece for people who were traveling to the Middle East and wanted to know how they could act when they were dining with business partners, because for business, obviously, this has a lot of really important implications. So I did a little piece for her, and I started thinking about this then, and then when Joel and Sarah called me, I just kind of brought everything back to me, and so I put it together in a little bit more complete format for you. So I hope that you like it today. We'll do the presentation, and then we'll have a little question and answer session, and then after that we're going to have a meal, and we're going to formulate the meal in a way that will help you to get a little bit of a better understanding of and etiquette as well of the culture. Does anybody have any questions before we get started? Okay. So this is the presentation, Communicating Across the Table and Learning about Arab Food Etiquette. Here's the Arab world. It's comprised of about 22 different countries now, and it spans all the way from Western North Africa all the way over until the Arabian Peninsula. So it's amazing to think that so many countries speak this one language, and yet within them, they're all distinct, diverse, they all have their own dialects and their own customs. But today we're going to talk about some general things that kind of overlap the different geographical borders. Food etiquette is based on a lot of different factors: history, religion, social status, education, personal tastes, superstition, family traditions, and geography all impact what we eat. And you can see here at this photo, this is a nice Middle Eastern spread that's put on in a hotel in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. There's a famous Arabic saying that the food equals the affection, and it's kind of like the more the better. They definitely do not prescribe to the less is more. If you want to impress somebody, if you want to show them how much you think of them, you put out as much food as you possibly can. And you worry about the waste later. You just want to make a good impression, and you want to get everything out there. And this has very ancient traditions. It's really important to remember when dining that you always should let your guest insist that you eat. If I were to come to you and offer you a drink, in the Arab world, it's very, very common for you to first tell me no, even if you really want the drink. Then I would have to offer it to you again, and you can still tell me no. Then I offer it to you a third time, and then you can drink, or if you are really, really polite and you still don't drink, I would set it down next to you and leave. That's the way you're supposed to offer someone food. So it's really interesting if you think of that 3 times. And it's very important because it crosses over, not only in the way we eat and drink, but to other things. If you're coming from a culture like this, where you're used to being offered something 3 times before you can say no, and you all of a sudden get plopped down into Montgomery County, and you go and someone offers you something and you say no thanks, and they take it away, imagine how that would be. And that's not just in food, that's also in other areas of our life as well. You really have to be nudged to take something and to accept something. So new immigrants have to really take it upon themselves to learn to be a little bit more aggressive and a little bit more direct, not only at the table, but when they're dealing with others as well. Eating and drinking with the right hand only. This is something that has been taking place since the 7th century and since the advent of Islam. And that's because traditionally, dating back from the 7th century, people are using the right hand to eat with and the left hand to clean themselves with. So if someone uses their left hand, it's not only because the left hand has a negative connotation like in the Christian church, but also this is the hand that you wash yourself with. So it really makes people squeamish and uncomfortable. So even if you're left-handed and you're going to be a lot in the Arab world and with traditional cultures, I would suggest to really practice using your right hand. I know it's hard. Once I had surgery on my right hand and I had to practice using my left, but after a little while you get it. It's worth the payoff. And always leave extra food on your plate. If you eat all of the food on your plate in the Middle East, it means that your host did not give you enough food. And if they have the food, they'll keep filling up your plate. So you want to make sure when you're taking that you leave a little bit to show that they gave you enough, especially if it's in a community that they don't have enough food. You always want to leave enough so that they don't feel like they were bad hosts or hostesses by eating everything. Some of these traditions date back to Bedouin times, and it's really important to study the Bedouins, even though sometimes in the Arab world people say, well, you know, that's a stereotype that we have about the Bedouins. And in modern world, it is a little bit of a stereotype, but the Bedouins were also responsible for laying the culinary and the etiquette foundations that correspond to dining all around the Arab world. And because the Bedouins were nomads, they traveled around with them, and hospitality was really important to them as they encountered other tribes. If you encountered another tribe and you were rude to them, then obviously, you know, you wouldn't get very far in the world. You had to have an interdependent relationship with other tribes. So Bedouins became known for their hospitality. They would travel around with them, and they would have camels, they would have sheep, which then turned into mutton. And their daily diets revolved around staples like bread and dates. The dates, of course, coming from the oases. They could dry them, travel with them very easily. And then they would milk the mutton or the sheep and also the camels. And the milk that they got from that would be used to make yogurt. It would also be used to make cheese. And that's what people were eating on their daily basis. Yogurt, cheese, milk, dates, things like this. They couldn't afford to eat meat every day because imagine you're traveling in the desert and you've got your animals with you. If you slaughter one and you eat it, first of all, there's no refrigeration, so you've got to have a big group and you've got to eat it all right then. Secondly, then you're one less down for your count of milk and all the other dairy products that you normally live on. So you can only afford to slaughter one of these animals and eat it when it's a holiday or when it's you're honoring some really important person coming or a wedding, something like that. So this is when the idea of meat being very important and very ceremonial came to be in the Middle East. It was all the way back in the Bedouins. And this is something that still takes place no matter where you are, whether you're in urban Lebanon or rural Egypt or in the Atlas Mountains in Morocco. If people give you meat and a lot of meat, it's because they respect you and they honor you and they're welcoming you as their guest. And even though there are many vegetarian delicious dishes, the meat is the symbol of respect and the symbol of hospitality in the Middle East. So these are some Bedouin women, and this is actually in Sinai in Egypt. This is in eastern Egypt in a little town called Nuweiba, which is about halfway up Sinai, the border between Egypt and Israel. And these are some traditional women in their gorgeous outfits that match perfectly the color of the water in that area. And these tribes all speak their own languages, and they have a little bit of their own customs, but generally the idea and the hospitality are the same. Here we have some Bedouins in Jordan. And they're eating a traditional dish called mansaf, which is a dish that's made with lots of yogurt, again coming from the animals, and sometimes a little bit of meat that's shredded into it, and some rice. It's a layered dish, and it's eaten communally. Pretty much everything Bedouin style is eaten communally. And even as we go into modern times in the Middle East and in the Arab world, it's very, very unlikely that you find people eating alone. And when they eat alone, they feel bad. They will go through all kinds of things, whether they're, you know, an executive or a student or whatever. They go to great lengths to be able to enjoy their meals with their families still. Here is a picture. We can see some embroidery, and this is the women sitting and making the mansaf together. Just like in the Native American tradition, there's a tradition of embroidery and telling history through embroidery. There is also this in the Palestinian tradition. So we can see a lot of historical things coming through in this type of embroidery. people sitting what we call in America Indian style on the floor with the legs crossed. This is very traditional. The idea of having to be in a seat doesn't really appeal to a lot of people. It's not comfortable for them. They'd rather be closer to the ground. So you see people, even on the street corners, sometimes sitting down this way and enjoying a meal together or preparing a meal together. Have any of you ever eaten this way, a regular meal? It's really a very unique experience. You do not have the same conversations that you have with people when you sit with them Indian style. You break a different barrier and you start talking about issues which are much more deep and much more personal. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. Here are some tips to remember when entertaining. It's always important, as we talked about earlier, to serve as large a meal as possible, as many things as possible. As we talked about also, the more meat, poultry, or seafood present, the better. Also, you want to treat your honored guests as family. In the West, a lot of times when we have an honored guest, we think of treating them like royalty. We break out the fine china, we get the best table setting we can do, we get the most expensive meals that we can make. We really kind of treat people with a little bit of a standoffish attitude, and this makes them feel more special, makes them feel more honored. In the Arab world, it's the opposite. The more they like you and the more they feel comfortable with you and the more that they want to honor you, and especially once they know that you're open to their beliefs, the more they will treat you like family. So maybe you'll be invited, somebody may have a very formal dining room in their home, but they'll invite you into another room where you'll sit on the floor and eat with them because they think of you like one of them. And that's not because they don't appreciate you, it's the opposite, it's because they appreciate you very much. Now, if you're sitting on the floor or even on the table in a traditional Arab setting, you're going to have everything within reach of people because it's considered rude to pass and it's considered rude to have to reach over somebody. So if, say you're having your main dishes, if it's a very long table, you might have 2 or 3 different plates of the main dish so that it's within reach of everybody. You'll have 2 or 3 different salads at the table so that it's within reach of everybody. And the same thing with everybody else. So nobody has to worry about serving or passing the plates or anything being out of reach. That's very, very typical. It's also very typical to make points, to make it a point to make food that everybody likes, because it's considered rude to have a food that not everybody can eat. So nowadays we have a lot of dietary restrictions and it's really hard. Everyone's on a diet or they're allergic to something or they can't have something. Your guests will go out of their way to ask you about all of these things in advance, and it's your duty, if they don't ask you, to tell them so that when you get there that you can partake in everything, because they would be very, very hurt if you can't. And it's also a very nice social thing to be able to, break bread and to eat the same things with everybody. So it's something that you'll notice. There's also things that you can avoid, and I talk about these later because these are, child's play. If you do the things you're supposed to do, what to avoid, it takes care of itself. But there are also a couple things to avoid. One of them is staring at other people's food. Have all of you heard of the evil eye? Okay, well, the evil eye is something that, predates religions. It's been in the Mediterranean world for a long time, not only in the Arab world, but in Southern Europe as well, like Italy and Greece and places like that. And this is an, evil eye warder offer. Eye, kind of a pendant that people use to protect themselves from the evil eye. But still today people talk about the evil eye a lot, and if you're staring at someone or you're staring at their food, people take it to mean that you would like to have what they have and that you're envious. Because you're envious, maybe you're giving them the evil eye and then maybe they're going to have bad repercussions because of you being envious. So it's very good not to stare at other people's plate. If you're in a restaurant and you want to order something, okay, that's fine. But if you're in an area, say, my friend Esther here had a beautiful plate of food and I was kind of hungry and I'm really eyeing that plate of food. That's not very good to do in terms of etiquette. Here is our table setting again. So just like we mentioned, we can see the main dishes. We've got one here, and then we've got the same thing right down here. And then we've got all these little pilot dishes like the hummus and the salads and the things that are the same all the way down. These aren't necessarily meant to be individual plates because sharing is welcome and encouraged, but it's just meant to be so that it's within reach of everybody. Now, there are also some folkloric superstitions which have to do with etiquette and have to do with diet. It's very interesting. Some of these folkloric traditions and superstitions we found to be true today in modern science. For example, red Mediterranean coral, Red Mediterranean coral was associated with life-sustaining blood, and people believed that it protected children from harm. And we can see today all of the foods, like the pomegranates and the tomatoes that have the lycopene, and they have all of the wonderful things in them that are good for purifying our blood. They've been scientifically proven, and have all of these other wonderful things that they ward off, like lowering your risk of prostate cancer and other kind of cancers. So they kind of have to do with one another. Yellow amber. Yellow amber is also a very good idea because it reflects sunlight, and people think that it reflects positivity. And we've also seen some of these yellow and amber colored foods like dates, which they have now been able to prove that they have lots of wonderful vitamins and minerals in them and antioxidants, which can protect us from many, many ailments. Now we start getting into the monotheistic faiths, and all of the monotheistic faiths also left an imprint on etiquette and dining in the Arab world. And the first one is Judaism. And one of the interesting things that you can see here in this picture, I apologize, it's kind of out of focus because I took this in the Agriculture Museum in Cairo. And this, what it says, is mortuary offering bread, and this was made by the ancient Jews that were in Egypt. And what it means is that in the ancient world, the Jews were combining their religious beliefs with the ancient Egyptian secular beliefs. So they were actually making mortuary offering breads just like the ancient Egyptians were. In antiquity in Egypt, whenever they had the tombs, they would put food in there so that the dead would be sustained in the afterlife. They even had food mummies. And of course, breads were also placed into these funeral chambers. So now we see that the Jews also did this, in addition to their own dining habits, like the kosher different laws that they had put in place in Egypt. So when this happened, this is the first time that we see kind of an etiquette in terms of we can't eat this because of religion, or we can eat this because of religion. Before that, everything in the Middle East was pretty much up for grabs. And this soup that we have down here is very timely because this is called meloucheya in Egypt, or Jew's mallow. It's called Jew's mallow in English because it's one of the bitter herbs that the Jews would have on the Seder plates, because this was an herb that is made in the soup that grew very abundantly in Egypt, and it was one of the things that the Egyptian Jews ate a lot. And now we have fasting. Well, a lot of times when we talk about fasting in the Arab world, everybody immediately thinks of Islam. But also we had a lot of fasting in Christianity. Christianity was introduced in about the 1st century AD with St. Mark. And when Christianity was introduced, it was introduced through the Roman Catholic Church. Little by little, the Egyptians and the Middle Eastern Arabs began to reject this type of Christianity, and they became very, very heavily involved with the church, so much so that the Roman Empire was worried that they would take them over. So the Roman Empire split in 395 AD, after 3 centuries. You see the Eastern Empire and the Western. The Eastern became what we know as Orthodox Christians or Coptic Christians, and then the Western became known as the Christians, the same type of Christianity that we have mostly here in the United States. And as we know, they have different calendars. Well, the Coptic or the Eastern or the Orthodox Christians, every year before their Easter, this Easter holiday is preceded by 55 days of fasting. Fasting doesn't mean that you don't eat anything from sunup to sundown in Christianity. In Christianity, it means that you're basically a vegan for 55 days. You can't have anything with dairy or with meat or with poultry or with seafood. So now here we have a culture, which I just mentioned how important the meat was to them because of the Bedouin times. And all of a sudden you have a new religion that doesn't let you eat any of that meat. So what do? So all of these really delicious fasting dishes were born out of this Christianity and the abolishment of meat during the 55-day fasting period. Things like falafel in Egypt. In Egypt we call falafel ta'amiyah. And this is made with fava beans. It's not made with chickpeas like it is in Lebanon and Israel and other places. But this was made to replicate meat for the people who were fasting. They also started doing vegetable kebabs. They also started in Lebanon, for example, they have delicious kibbehs. Many of you know the kibbeh, which are made with the burgle wheat and the ground meat. Well, for Lenten times, they do them with pumpkin instead of the meat. So these dishes became so popular over time that nowadays they've almost replaced even the meat dishes in some areas. And it's still very, very hospitable if you're going to have Christian guests to your home to make sure that if it's during a fasting period. Also, the Orthodox Christians, some of them fast on Mondays and Thursdays. So that means, again, they have to have the vegan diet on Monday and Thursdays. So even if you don't have the same religion, but they're coming to your home, it's a really good idea to find out when they're fasting and when they're not. And then Islam came into Egypt in the 7th century AD. It was actually introduced in Saudi Arabia in the 7th century, but it came into Egypt in the same century. And this is when we start to see a lot of Muslim kind of ideals of etiquette and dining to start being spread throughout the Mediterranean and the Arab world. Here you can see, this is a picture of a mosque in Cairo. This is called the Amr ibn al-As Mosque, and it was the first one that was put there because this was the person who introduced Islam into Egypt from the Arabian Peninsula. And it has this very spare style. This is very much like the styles that they have in Andalusia in the beginning and also in Medina, Saudi Arabia. In those days, they did everything very spare. They didn't want to have a lot of human representation because they were worried that it would rival the religion. So they left everything very spare like this. But it was very important etiquette-wise. It was very important cultural-wise because the Muslims had control of the spice trade. And a lot of what we know in the Mediterranean, a lot of the cities, and in the Middle East as well, were built by spices. Some were built by salt. Some were built by other spices. Pepper, things that we take for granted that are on our tables every day and that we just throw away, built actual cities. So this was very important because these empires started to form a lot of what was later handed down into Europe. So we talked a little about the birth of Islam in Mecca. This is a place called the Mountain of Light in Mecca. And it was in a cave in this mountain where the Prophet Muhammad used to meditate that the Quran was actually revealed. And this revolutionized everything in the Arab world. First of all, you have the 5 pillars of Islam. You have Shahada, which is a declaration. This is a proclamation that people take when they become Muslim and they say that there's only one God. The second one is the daily salat, or the prayer. There are 5 daily prayers in Islam that people perform who are practicing their religion. This is very important, and we'll talk about all of these individually later. The Sum, or the fasting, charity, and the pilgrimage to Mecca. And these are all people making the pilgrimage on the lower level. And this is the Kaaba right here in the main mosque in Mecca. So the first pillar we talked about is the Shahada. This is the Prophet Muhammad's mosque in Medina. And if you look inside of it, it looks very, very similar to the one that we saw in Cairo. And the reason for that is because this is early Islamic style. It's very spare, very, very old Arabian. And it was built here. And this, like I said, revolutionized everything because all of a sudden now in the Arab world, in the Arabian Peninsula, they didn't have Christianity. So this is the first time when they're getting people coming in and saying, okay, you can't eat pork, you can't have alcohol. These kind of laws are being handed down. And the second pillar, or the salat, or the prayer, people are now all of a sudden required to pray 5 times a day. So if you're required to pray 5 times a day, this sets up a particular schedule in your daily life. Remember, this is before clocks. It's before our modern day classes that lasted 40 minutes. Things were very different back then. So to all of a sudden have this regimen every day, this helped to unify meal times. And people would eat breakfast, for example, after the dawn prayer. They would eat lunch after the noon prayer. They would eat dinner after the evening prayer. So things started becoming more and more uniform in the Arab world. Then we have the fasting. Now, fasting in Islam happens 1 time a year during the main month, happens 1 time a year during the month of Ramadan. And this is when people fast from sun up to sundown. During this time, I get a lot of questions revolving around etiquette in Ramadan because a lot of people want to go to countries in Ramadan and people tell them, no, don't go, you can't eat, they'll get mad at you, they'll put you in jail. It's not true. You can go, you can be in an urban area, you can eat what you want. Even if you're in a rural area and you explain to people that you're not Muslim, they will offer you food and let you eat, and food is available everywhere. But people who are practicing their religion fast from sun up to sundown, which means nothing can pass your throat. So no water, no gum, no smoking, no anything, literally from sun up until sundown. You have a big meal before this day starts, and you have a big meal when the sun comes down. And this has to have all of the nutrients to kind of sustain you. But it's a very wonderful time if you ever have the chance to travel at this time, because it's like if you come here during Christmas and everything is lit up with lights and everyone's having a great time and visiting their family and the world slows down. It's that kind of a pace. So it's great to go and visit if you can. Here are some people breaking their fasts, and you have these people here on the floor sitting and breaking them, and you have the people here at a modern kind of a fast food takeout kind of a place. Apricot juice is almost always present, and that's one of the first things that people drink when they break their fast. They first break it with a date, some water. This is in the prophetic tradition, and then little after that you'll see apricot juice. Why apricot juice? I always just thought, this is great, I love apricot juice, and who cares? But there's actually scientific reason. This is an ancient Arabian remedy for dehydration, a mixture of apricot paste and water. Nowadays, they've proven it to be scientifically true, and everyone just happens to have it during Ramadan. So it works, and it's very delicious. And I talked a little bit about dates. Dates and dining etiquette in the Middle East are very, very, they're related to one another. This is a book called the 100 Hadith. Hadith are the recorded sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad. And in the Muslim faith, they're very, very important. A lot of the modern Middle Eastern dining trends in the Arab world and in the Muslim world have to do with what was in these hadith, because there are volumes on just eating. And one of the things that are really promoted to eat are dates. Dates are given as a gift. In the ancient times, they were used to settle debts. They were also used to make mortar in building buildings. Up until the 19th century in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, they actually used a date paste as a mortar when they made the stone buildings. And you can see all of the things that dates have been proven, at least in the Arab world, to cure. They treat heart disease, anemia, allergies, constipation, dizziness, heartburn, acid reflux, halting cancer, and excessive bleeding during pregnancy. So they're used a lot. You'll see them a lot. And if people give you dates, it's quite a significant gift, more than just you would get from here. Now we talk about zakat, which means charity. Charity is very important in Arab etiquette, also in the food world, because instead of giving charity something that you don't want, or that's inexpensive, or that easily can stretch and feed a lot of people, you're encouraged to give charity of what you would want the most. And what is that? Meat. So people often give meat and have animals slaughtered to give as charity. That's very, very common in the Muslim world and in the Arab world. There's a holiday that comes after Ramadan called the Eid al-Fitr, or the holiday of the fast breaking. And this is a 3-day holiday that comes after the month of Ramadan. People break their fasts. And in Egypt, they make these delicious little cookies, which are called the Eid Kak. But there's a special kind of charity giving during this holiday called the Zakat al-Fitr. And this is a special charity that if you give this charity, then your month of Ramadan and your fasting and your good deeds are accepted by God. That's the belief. So in the 10th century, the caliphs used to make these cookies, and they would stuff them with gold coins in the palace kitchens, and they would distribute these to the poor. So it's very interesting, because they would give them a delicious treat, but they would also give them something which they could use, which was money. And then we have the Hajj. And the Hajj is one of the single most acts in the Arab world that introduced food and introduced cultures from around the world and helped very closed communities to become very, very cosmopolitan and used to dealing with one another and cross cultures, because you all of a sudden have people coming from all corners of the world to Mecca and meeting there and exchanging ideas and thoughts and recipes. A lot of the people who went to Hajj just to perform the pilgrimage never made it back to their homelands. They stayed there and they settled and they mingled with the people in Saudi Arabia, and they became part of the local culture. So you will see many people in Saudi Arabia who are originally from Central Asia or originally African, and they're now living there. It's not a homogeneous culture. And the food also reflects that, and the culture also reflects that. So here are some of the Islamic customs on eating. People who are very religious will usually start and end the meal, or eat also in rural settings, because this is what they were trained to do. They will start and end the meal with the name of God. They always wash their hands before and after a meal. They always wait to be asked to eat. They don't just help themselves. As we mentioned before, eating and drinking with your right hand only. And when you're done eating, the minute you individually, personally are done eating, you're supposed to pull back from the table, excuse yourself, thank God, and then go and wash your hands. And then go and sit somewhere else. You're not supposed to linger at the table, which is very different, I think, from a lot of us and from a lot of European standards. This is very perfectly polite. So if you go to someone's home or you're dining with someone and they automatically do that, they weren't mad by what you said or they weren't offended by you. They're just done with their meal. They're going to go to another room and they're going to wait for you to finish the meal and come and join them. Never to lay down or lounge while eating. Before the advent of the religion, there were a lot of really rich, kings and people who treated people unfairly. And one of the ways that they acted was they would always lounge and recline when they had a meal. So when Islam came in, they said, no, you're supposed to sit up while you eat. It promotes digestion, and it also helps that kind of classism of some people being able to lounge and other people having to serve. And then, of course, thank God after the meal. As I mentioned, the pilgrimage to Mecca really did a lot for the cuisine of the Middle East. And one of the things that we have nowadays to show for it is coffee. Coffee originally came from Ethiopia, and it was discovered by some Abyssinian monks in the Middle Ages. That's when it was discovered. They noticed that their goats and that their old tired mares would take a little bit of the coffee berry and burn it onto a very hot stone, and then they would nibble on it, and they would all of a sudden start jumping and acting like they were very young animals again. So the people started eating them and then eventually brewing them, roasting them, and making it into what we know as modern day coffee. When they did this, they realized that it had stimulant properties. So the people who were the Sufis, this is a mystical sect of Islam. They are people who would stay up all night long and have what we call zikr, or remembrance ceremonies that they would chant. And they would use the coffee to help them stay awake. They discovered how good it was. People from just across the Red Sea, Yemen, came over to visit the people in Ethiopia, and they said, these were also Sufis, they were their brethren, and they said, we'll give you this coffee, we'll help you stay awake during your ceremonies. They took it back to Yemen, they loved it, they started growing it in Yemen. So Yemen is known for coffee. But what's really interesting about the Yemeni coffee is that whole terrain in Yemen is very, very inhospitable to the plant. And the Yemenis had to develop wonderful irrigation systems in order for the coffee to take root. Once it took root, it not only did it do well, but it did so well that it became to be known the best in the world. And the Dutch exclusively wanted the coffee from a place called Al Mocha, which now we call mocha in English, because it was known to have a little bit of a chocolate-like flavor to it. And whenever they wanted to make this coffee from Al Mocha, they would add a little bit of chocolate that they just got from Latin America into this drink, and it became known as what we know now as mocha coffee. The Yemenis went to the pilgrimage in Mecca, met some Egyptian Sufis there, gave the coffee to the Egyptians. Egyptians brought it back to Egypt when the Turks were in control. And the Turks said, we don't have to keep this in the churches. This is something that everybody could like. We're going to introduce it, we're going to export it to the world, and we're going to introduce it as the wine of the Arabs. And of course it did very well, and within no time France had coffee houses. In the 1600s, Cairo had about 650 coffee houses. So that's a huge amount. This is before Europe ever even knew about coffee. And then little by little it started trickling into places. Vienna became famous for the coffee houses because it was ruled by the Turks also, and the Turks had the control of the coffee. So it's very, very interesting. And you can see here, this is a picture of Turkish coffee. It's made in a little traditional pot that's brewed on the stove, and then it has a glass of water by it. You will always be served in the Middle East coffee with water. And it's for a couple different reasons. One, coffee tends to dehydrate you a little bit, so you need water to replenish you. But there's also a social and an etiquette implication. The coffee tends to have the spirit of the person who made it in it. It's very poetic. So if you like someone's coffee, it means you like them as a friend. You're accepting them. There's an old Turkish proverb that says, the heart seeks neither the coffee nor the coffee house. The heart seeks a friend, and coffee is just an excuse. So when someone gives you coffee in the Arab world, you drink the water, quench your thirst, and then you drink the coffee. You never drink water after the coffee. If you do, it means you're washing out their coffee taste, and it means that you didn't like their coffee. It's an insult. So you always start with the water, end with the coffee, or just do the coffee. And we have another holiday in the Muslim world called the Eid al-Adha, or the Feast of the Sacrifice. Again, this is adding another layer of importance to meat. Just like the Bedouins started, now you have, after centuries and centuries, when Islam came into power, people again favoring the meat. This holiday, this is very closely linked to the Bible and the Old Testament story of Abraham and Isaac. Except in the Quran version, it's Abraham and Ishmael, when Abraham has the dream and he has to slaughter his son, but then he's spared from having to do that. How the Muslims celebrate that is they're all ordered to have slaughtered for them an animal, and then to divide the meat into three parts. One part you keep for yourself, one of the thirds you can keep for yourself, another third you can give to your friends and family, and then another third you give to the poor. And that's distributed out as charity. And this happens once a year. So there's lots of meat around at this time, and people eat meat-based recipes. It's also considered a waste to throw the meat away. So even if people didn't care about the meat in the beginning because of the Bedouin traditions, or they'd forgotten about them, here, centuries later, you have another really meat-important holiday coming along. And also in the 7th century, a lot of the food traditions were brought and introduced from the area of Egypt and North Africa into southern Spain. And that's because there was a group called the Umayyads, they were a caliphate, and they ruled southern Spain, what we know as Andalusia nowadays. When the Muslim prince first went there, he was expelled from the area of Syria, and he went there to set up shop in southern Spain. And this was like barren, Wild West. There was nothing there. So what was he going to do? All of a sudden you had all these palaces in Baghdad and this beautiful court life, all of these wonderful things going on, and you're stuck in the middle of nowhere now. So he employed someone named Ziryab. Ziryab was his nickname, but his real name was Abul Hassan, and he was kind of like what we would consider to be an indentured servant in the palaces in Iraq. He got his freedom. He was employed by this Muslim prince in Spain, and he made the journey from Iraq all the way over the Mediterranean into southern Spain. And he was the style setter of his time. He was much more than just a servant. He was someone who set down all of the fashion trends, the dining trends, the music trends, and much of what we know about Spanish culture today came from this one gentleman. And he was the person who said that we should only wear white in warm weather. He was the one who said that men should keep their hair cut short. He was the person who introduced rice, okra, hibiscus, and many spices from Egypt into southern Spain. After that, when the Spaniards came and colonized the New World, they brought a lot of these ingredients with them. This is why in Mexico and in Jamaica, you have the hibiscus or the sorrel, or the agua de Jamaica, that we call carcade in Egypt. It was because of this one person, his influence in bringing all of these things around. The same thing with the rice dishes, the same thing with the okra. He caused all of these things to kind of move. He had 10,000 songs committed to his memory. So that's more than 4 gigas nowadays. He knew them all by heart. He founded a school of dance in Andalusia, which became the base of the modern flamenco dancing. So he did a lot to unify the Mediterranean and the Arab world and to set trends. Trends were very, very lavish in this time. We can see the lute down here. This is the ancestor of the modern guitar, and this was something that Ziryab introduced into southern Spain. Now, the North African countries all have this idea of the hand, and it crosses religions. You can see it in pre-religious cultures, you can see it in Judaism, in Christianity, and Islam. Everyone has the symbol of the hand. The Jews call it the hand of God, the Muslims call it the hand of Fatima. Fatima was the Prophet Muhammad's daughter. And there was an actual caliphate that took their name after her. They were called the Fatimids, and they ruled North Africa in the 9th century. So this hand is kind of one of those things that protects against the evil eye and wards off all of the good spirits. You'll see this everywhere, and it's very, very common for people to have that. And a lot of recipes, a lot of cultural traditions were spread by the Fatimids because the Fatimids loved to party. And everywhere that they ruled, they wanted people to have celebrations. They claimed power in Cairo in 969 AD, but they had claimed power in Sicily 50 years before that. So what happened was when their empire involved all these parts of the North African, like Egypt, like Sicily, you start seeing all of these trends merging. And they would force people to go out and celebrate together. And so, for example, say last week it was Easter. Everybody would go out and celebrate Easter, whether they were Christian or not. The Jews, the Muslims, the Christians together. They mandated it. They would set up lights on the Nile, and they caused everybody to celebrate together. They did this because they wanted peace, and they wanted harmony, and they wanted everybody to partake in everybody's holidays. So I think it's really interesting if you think back 11 centuries ago, the people could do that, and people had that insight, and that they all enjoyed and learned from one another without, at the same time, disrespecting their own beliefs. It's really very, very amazing. But the Fatimids, because they did this, a lot of these ideas of festival foods that we have around the Mediterranean are the same. If you go into an import store, Italian import, Spanish import, Greek, during Christmas time, you're going to see lots of nougats, lots of sesame candies, lots of things like this. These were all from the Fatimid times, and these were all spread to the different countries. Everybody thinks theirs is the best. Everyone thinks that their feast has the only one, but they don't. They all have them for the same reason, and it's all because of the Fatimids. Now, in the 12th century, we start seeing what's called the golden era of Islam. And this is when we see really, really ornate Muslim dishes and palace cuisine that is rivaled to nothing else we've ever seen before. This is an Abbasid coin. The Abbasid Caliphate was based in Iraq. And we see this coin being found up in Sweden. This is actually from a museum in Stockholm. So we know that there was trading going on between the people in the Middle East and the Arabian Peninsula and Sweden because of these coins that we find. That's why you have ingredients like cardamom, which are heavily used in India and in the Arabian Peninsula. All of a sudden you see them in Swedish desserts. That's because of this influence. And we can see all of these spices here. This is a Nubian spice market in Egypt. Now, these are two really interesting people, Al-Kindi and Avicenna. Avicenna was the father of modern medicine. He was a product of the Abbasid Caliphate in Iraq. During this time period in the 12th century, people were so educated that they would often have about 20 different job titles each. A person would be literally a philosopher, a physician, an astronomer, a dentist, a poet, a you name it, you name it, you name it. 10 to 15 different things at one time, and they would do them all well because they were so well educated. The Abbasids granted free education to everybody, even the military classes, which was really, really unheard of in those days. So a lot of enlightenment happened during this time period in the fields of science and mathematics, and also in cooking. This person wrote a medieval cookbook, an Arabic cookbook, and we still have today about 13 different medieval Arabic cookbooks that you can go back and reference and see what they were doing at this time period. One of the things that they did that was so smart was that they didn't try to reinvent the wheel. They took whatever ancient Egypt, ancient Rome, ancient Greece had on hand, and they built on it. They also took a lot from the Persians, which was in their neighboring country. And whatever the Persians had already discovered, they also took from that and built on it. So you have a really, really rich cuisine in these type of books. Here's a little bit about the Persian influence. We see things like sweet and sour ingredients. We see things like pomegranates and berries and sweet things being mixed with meat. Nowhere else in the Middle East was this taking place other than Persia. But because of the Persians and because of the Abbasids looking to them and taking some of their styles, they then implemented it further and further west. So that's why now in places like Morocco, you can get some of those sweet and sour fruit and meat dishes. It's because of the Abbasid influence. Here's a picture of the Cairo Citadel. This was built in the 12th century by Saladin, and it was built to keep the Crusaders out. What's interesting is how elaborate the food was in this time period. During the reign of Sultan al-Nasr Muhammad, they were making 12,000 tons of food per day in that kitchen. 12,000 tons. That's like what we do in a modern restaurant chain in America in a year. It's a really, really huge amount, and they were doing it every day. They would not release poor people from the hospital until they could eat an entire chicken in one sitting. If you were poor and you were in the hospital, you were getting free medical care, they would keep you in there and keep you under supervision and treat you until you could eat a whole chicken. If you could eat a whole chicken in one sitting, then they knew that you were healthy and you could be released. So imagine. Now by comparison, 300 years later in 16th century France, King Henry promised that he would put a chicken in every pot on Sundays for a family. So you have 300 years later, French are dreaming of one chicken a week, and these people were making poor people eat chickens like they were nothing. So a lot of wealth and a lot of really elaborate dining styles. The fountains that were outside used to flow not with water, but with sherbet. You can imagine a hot climate like Cairo, what it would take to make ice cream pre-freezing. They would have all of these elaborate systems of people bringing ice down from mountains and shipping it over and keeping it in cold chambers. So they really valued food as an art form. And this period transformed what we know is Renaissance dining, because you know the Renaissance also wasn't born out of nothing. It was born out of all of these other trends that were already very closely linked in the Mediterranean. Then in the 16th century, we have the Ottomans. And the Ottomans took it again another step further. They had the Topkapi Palace in Constantinople. This palace used to hire 1,300 cooks per day. Every day they had 1,300 cooks working in that one palace kitchen. Each of those 1,300 cooks had 100 understudies. And each of those cooks and their 100 understudies, or sous chefs as we now call them, could only make one dish in their whole life. So if I was working there, and say I was in charge of grape leaves, me and all of my 100 sous chefs would be making grape leaves for our whole life. And that's really good because what it did, although it was not very fortunate for them, but pre-computers, it helped them to pass down their recipes to the further generations. And that's how we know now what's Turkish and what isn't. And there were no limits to what the palaces had control of. They had sugar and spices and things that were very rarely used by commoners. So this set the standards of dining and set the standards of royalty to be very, very high. And again, little by little, the Europeans started inventing this as well. We also see with the Turks, they had very poetic ways of calling things. They would call, for example, a dessert ladies' navels or ladies' hips or something like this. This became very popular in Italy, and you can see in Venice, which was a sister city of Constantinople, they have some of the very similar names for very similar recipes, and this is because of this Turkish influence. Now we have Arabian tea, and Arabian tea came much later than coffee because people drink tea a lot in the Middle East, especially in North Africa. A lot of people think that it was there since the beginning of time, but it wasn't. It was traded with China, and many of the countries didn't have it until even the 19th century. So it's relatively new in the Arab world in terms of flavors and in terms of customs, but it's very, very important. And there's an old Arabian tea story, and the story goes that there's an old gentleman in a market. He's selling his wares. He goes there every day, and there's a young gentleman who comes and he sees him every day. And the old man never says hi to the young man. So finally the young man stops and he says, you know, I pass by you every day, and our custom dictates that you should say hello to me and ask me how I'm doing, but you never do. And he said, I want to know, what do you have to lose? And the old man just nodded. He came back the next day and he said it again. He said, you know, our custom dictates you're supposed to say hello to me. You never say hello to me. I want to know, what do you have to lose? So the man says, finally he turns to me and he says, son, I have a lot to lose. He said, let me tell you, if you ask me, if I say hello to you, then I have to ask you how you're doing, and you'll say fine. Then, as our custom dictates, I have to invite you into our home for tea. So I'm going to invite you into our home to tea, and you, as our custom dictates, have to accept. So you come to the home, and I offer you tea. You're sitting in my living room, and we're talking together. And as our custom dictates, my daughter has to make the tea for you. So, as custom dictates, the daughter comes into the room carrying the tea. And son, once you see my daughter, you will understand that I have a lot to lose by offering you a cup of tea and by saying hello. So then we have the 20th century. Now in the 20th century, a lot of the Europeans start coming into the Arab world, and especially into places like Egypt, because they were very cosmopolitan and they were enjoying a very high living standard. So many Europeans were actually emigrating into, Greeks and Italians and Spaniards were emigrating into Egypt. And one of the things that they did was they brought their new coffee culture with them. And these beautiful European types of coffee houses you can now find all over the Middle East. And this is kind of a nod back to this time. As this happened, then something else unique happened. With this new group of immigrants, the Middle Easterners, the Arabs, started saying, you know, the way that they act is really nice. Their foods are much more spare than ours. They're much more simple. It's kind of a less is more philosophy. And they have quicker cooking foods. They don't do their stews for hours and hours the way that we do them. They do them in a much more quick manner. And they deal with each other differently. And they deal more directly. So what you started seeing in this time was that the Arabs started copying European styles of easier ways of cooking, more simplified ways of cooking, and also of etiquette. It was very popular for Arab royalty to send their daughters, their wives, their sisters over to go to finishing school in Europe during this time period. And you see all of these cultures starting to mix. So here we see some people, this is in the 19th century, and they're sitting there at a traditional Arab table, but they're trying to use out their new European manners. And then in the 1920s, the birth of meze started to really take place in Lebanon. And these small dishes, or small plates, or appetizers as we call them, were always there in the Arab world, and they were always part of the local cuisine, especially in places like Lebanon and Syria in the Levant region. But they really started taking off in the 1920s in the Bekaa Valley because of modern transportation. They used to have only a few restaurants during this area, and people would had to go by the trails. But once trains started making their way through, people would go in the train, and the trains would stop, and they would go into these little taverns to eat. And they have a drink called raki, which is kind of like ouzo. It's an anisey aperitif. People would drink this, and they would need something to eat while they drink. So the owners of the taverns would start to make some of these little meze. Well, as more and more started coming, more and more taverns started being opened, and then it became a rivalry of who could make the most and who could make the best. So now you'll have dinners and occasions where you have like 38 or 40 different types of these little small plates that precede the meals. And it's very, very much a symbol of hospitality, just like the meat is, to offer the more you can, to offer the biggest variety, and to offer the best ones. For cooks and for restaurant chefs, this type of food was very interesting in Lebanon because you're dealing with a cuisine that's very old, and that no one's really reinvented the wheel a lot. So all of a sudden you get these appetizers which give you a lot of more room for kind of creative interpretation and a little bit more artistic license. So they took off, and they, more than anything, are our modern idea of what the food of the Arab world is, because Lebanese are wonderful, wonderful restaurateurs. And there are more Lebanese living outside of Lebanon in the world, in North America, Europe, South Africa, than there are in Lebanon nowadays. So that's why, because of these Lebanese restaurants and because of their delicious meze, this is what we associate with Middle Eastern cuisine, even though it's only a small portion of it. So here's some different dining styles in Saudi Arabia, and you can see this is a living room. And one of the things that's very typical, people will have a Western style dining room with a table and things like that, but when you're really, really welcome, they'll usher you into a room like this, and they'll, remember, nobody wears shoes in the house anyway, so the floors aren't dirty. So then they'll take away the tables, and they'll put down a tablecloth, very elaborate tablecloth, just like you would an elaborate table setting, and everyone will sit down and eat this way. And this is a less formal one, where you see people, they're using a plastic tablecloth. And here's some more different dining styles. You can see people just enjoying street food together, and then kind of a restaurant with this very open patio type of elegant feeling. And here are some of my cookbooks. This one that I wrote, this is on the Arabian Peninsula. This has Saudi Arabia, Oman, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, Yemen, UAE, all of those countries and their culture and their customs are covered in this book. And then I have this one, Nile-style Egyptian cuisine and culture. And one of my goals is, as I write the cookbooks, is I try to introduce people not only to the recipes and how to make them easily, but what is really behind the recipes, what we have in common, what we can learn, and what we can share from the food that we eat. And this is my newest one that just came out, the Mediterranean Diabetes Cookbook. Do we have any questions? Unless you're in a restaurant, it would be very, very rude to ask, period, is rude. So, you know, sometimes I'm like dying of thirst and I just wait and wait and wait until I can't, I mean, usually I just wait and wait, but I have a funny story about that. I was always very good about that, saying no 3 times. And a lot of times, because you're going as a guest, you're getting offered a lot of meat, and I don't really care about meat that much, so it's very easy for me to say no 3 times to meat. Well, then all of a sudden they came around with this dessert that I love called basbousa, which is this delicious cake it's made with the semolina flour and some butter and the sweet syrup on top, and they offered me the basbousa. I completely forgot about the 3, and I grabbed with both hands instead of just my right hands, and everybody burst out laughing because they knew that I just, you know, I couldn't resist the dessert. The symbol, usually people, they kind of do this thing and they put their napkin down and they say thank God, and then they leave, and you know, like they're done. And oh, and this is a great tip too. If you don't want to eat more and you're like, you're done, you're done, you're done, and they keep force feeding you, which will happen a lot, then you just say, you know, no, I already thank God, I already thank, because if you already thank God, they don't have to offer you more. So it's just, you know, offer the thanks really quickly and you'll be out of having to overstuff yourself. The only place that it's a real rule in the Arab world that you have to keep yourself covered is when you're going in mosques. You always want to cover your head, cover everything when you're going in a mosque. Or if you're in a religious area in Saudi Arabia. But if you're a foreigner, you wouldn't be there anyway, so it would be okay. So you'll be fine. You do not have to. But I would say with that, dress more respectively. Everyone says that, so people run around in, like, you know, sports tops and little short shorts. And I would use your better income. If everyone else is covered up, just try to be a little more loose, a little bit more covered than you would here, and people will give you less of a hassle. No kitchen help. There's no this idea of, can I lend you a hand, go in the kitchen, roll up your sleeves. It's a really big offense if you go into people's kitchen and you try to help them out. You're their guest and they're supposed to just do everything for you. Then in turn you invite them at one time when they come to America to your home and you keep them sitting and you do everything. It's just the way it is.